Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the workshop. Okay, so today, what is normally the hero of a pharmacoepi study? The hero is the association between an exposure and an outcome. And since it is pharmacoepi, normally the exposure is utilization of a medicine and the outcome is a disease. But this is not our hero today. Our hero today is this. So this is also a causal association. It's the causal association between a disease experienced in the population that we are studying and the measurement of such disease that we have when we make our study with a reuse of existing data. So it's not a primary data collection. We are using data that are out there to measure a disease in our population. And this is causal, meaning that it's the disease that causes the measurement and not the other way around. Okay? Why is this guy important? Why did we gather from all over the world today to discuss about this guy? First, because this guy is a variable. When we do our study, we condition upon this variable. In some sense, it's really the variable that we see. Our true outcome is not unmeasured, right? Which means that if there is a causal relationship really between the exposure and the measurement, so if our measurement is differential per exposure stratum, this creates an association. So it's a collider we adjust for. Or we may have another disease that has the same measurement. It happens. We may have false positives. And that disease may be associated with our outcome. And so this may also bias our study. And of course, the two things can easily coexist. And we may have confounders also that create this relationship. So this is important from a causal point of view. Second reason why this is important. So in our world, in pharmacoepi, often we say, well, let's assume that there are no false positives. Why that? And let's assume that there is no differential misclassification, right? So the two arrows that we saw earlier, let's assume that they don't exist, right? This fixes our causal DAG in terms of relative risks, but still we underestimate risk. So if we are losing people, if we don't see people with the disease, which may underestimate the true public health impact of our disease, which may cause real problem when we need to compare different, so like doing risk differences, for example, when making public health decision. So this is the case when, there is a differential misclassification and there are no false positives. The relative risk is always the same, 1.2, but the risk difference is double, actually, in reality, if we really adjust. And we have one of the Strobe statements that makes it clear that absolute risks should be reported whenever important for public health reasons. So two reasons to why this is important. And what is the third? What about misclassification across time? So our studies often go through time. So we may find ourselves that maybe the misclassification of our variable changes across time, or maybe it's not really misclassified, but maybe it is delayed. And maybe it is delayed in a differential manner, right? Like people with vaccines will have their disease anticipated because they were vaccinated. They have mild symptoms. There is an alert, and then suddenly I realized that there is a disease. This happened in 2009 with narcolepsy. So before we start today, let's try to understand, to get to know our heroes a bit more closely. Let's start with an example, type 2 diabetes, right? So we have on the left our study population, which has type 2 diabetes in some distribution, right? So this happens. And then some people go to primary care because they go to their physician, they get tested, then maybe they will go to the pharmacy to get some anti-diabetic medications. And then they will go to hospital, not because of diabetes, of course, but they may go to hospital because of a different disease, possibly caused by diabetes or not. So there are actions, Due to the fact that the disease exists, actions follow. The population activate actions. And this, in our world of real-world data, this causes records to pop up, to be prompted into our data sources, right? This does not depend on the person or on the disease. This is something that exists for reasons that have nothing to do with us. And so the record exists, and the content is then populated by somebody with codes or other content that may actually be in parallel caused by type 1 diabetes, right? So some of the codes that I am exhibiting here could equally be caused by type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes or even other diseases. So there may be some things that are modified not only by our original disease of interest, but by others, okay? And finally, we get access, we come into play just now, because up to now, we could do nothing. Everything that happened was outside, completely outside of our control. And now we access this thing and we say, you know what, guys that have this code here or that code there, they are people with type 2 diabetes, okay? This is the typical pathway that happens in our data sources. And when we query the data source to understand the distribution of type 2 diabetes in our population. And before generalizing this, I will just, so something that is very important to point to your attention is that in some data sources, some of those actions do not cause anything, okay? Like in Italian data, if you go to primary care, nothing happens. Nothing exists, right? So we can forget that specific data bank. And before we generalize this, I will quickly introduce a work that has been done in ISPI and that is being completed last May, and we are now in the process of creating some guidelines on how to use it. These are 9 dimensions that we believe, that we think, so we have reviewed all the literature, and we do think that those 9 dimensions are important determinants of our hero. Okay, so the determinants of diabetes per se are obesity, other things, but the determinants of the measurement of obesity are those guys, according to us, okay? And they are the organization that access the data and then tell you all the other dimensions, the data originator, the guy who pay for the data to exist, and the guys who do make content, they do put the content, the prompts, so the set of actions that do create records, and those that don't, how the population is included, not in your study, in the data source. So remember that everything that is included in your study is included in the data source, is nested here. So this is very important determinants of your measurement. The content, so which are the variables that are measured whenever a record is prompted, and the data dictionary, so how those variables are whether they are ICD-9, ICD-10, categorical variables, or whatever. The time span, so when that started and how recent it ended and things like that. The healthcare system and culture, so how is it that the guys who have type 2 diabetes go to primary care? Can they do that? Is that something that they are allowed to do, that they would do easily? Or do people that would vaccinate do that more easily than people who would not vaccinate? How is that? And then data quality, but data quality for their primary purpose, which is not our purpose, right? So these are the 9 dimensions of diverse, and how do these 2 things mix in general? We have our disease, So in our study population, the disease occurs. And we have the dimension inclusion in the population that tells us who is really our study population, where are they really nested into, how is entrance and exit from this population measured? Are you really sure that you know when the guy has left the GP office, you know the date is correct or not? This is important. This is really important. And then actions follow, right? Which actions? Well, that depends a lot on the healthcare system and culture, right? Because if you don't have primary care accessible to everybody, that action will not exist, right? And this also depends on the person, because you will be richer, more educated, less, male, female, no, only male and female. And, or it depends on the disease, because of course there will be diseases that will, you need to go to the emergency room because it's really immediate. And other diseases where no, it may take 3 years for the symptoms to be serious enough for you to do something, right? You may die. You may die. And then does death prompt anything in your data source or not? These are actions. And then a nice thing about real world data, which are normally not very nice for many things, but for this, yes, is that if those actions are enacted, then the records exist. That does not depend on whether you are rich or poor, on whatever happens. If you go to hospital, the record is created. If you buy a reimbursed medicines, the record is created. So this is good. Prompts, good. Very important dimension of diverse. And then the content of the records is populated, right? And this now may depend on the person. For example, on exposure stratum. You get to the emergency room with a rash, and they ask you, which medicines do you take? And if they know that the medicine that you take is, was found or is associated with some specific adverse reaction, is more likely that you are coded with that specific reaction. Otherwise, they would write rash. It's a part of the differential. So the content, yes, does depend on the person and on their exposure stratum. It may also depend on the disease itself, right? How you choose the coding. If it is something very specific, maybe you use a general code. And then it depends on the data source, on the dimension of content. What is it that you record on the data originator? Why is it that the records are created and populated? Is it for reimbursement purposes? So then maybe if there are two concurrent things that are happening, you may code the one that is more expensive or in terms of resources, or clinical more important, right? So the creation of the record does not depend on many things, but the content of the record, yes. So that may be differential. And this is where Shabby and we come up. We are only here. Everything exists already. What is our choice? Our choice is to make the phenotype, right? We are somehow passive users of this mechanism. But we have, as part of our team, the organization who accesses this data, who normally has knowledge and can help us to tailor our algorithm or to understand the characteristic of the algorithm, because they can tell us all the other dimensions. They can explain that to us, right? And be careful that the phenotype, not only we are the last, the last one in the food chain of the measurement of the disease, but remember we have also always the problem of false positives. So the same records may have been created by other diseases, right? And this is a trade-off. This is our life, right? What happens today? So this is the picture, and I'm happy to respond to some questions if this is not clear. So this is how I see it, right? This has been my research for many years today. So we have introduced a reader, we have explained why it is important, we have understood that a bit, or at least the way I see them. What happens today? So today we go through this, right? First, Vin. Vin tells us how this is fitting in our current pharmacoepi research, how it fits our current pipeline, how do we study normally with this, how we face that. And Vera and Amir will focus in particular on the action of, so we have the phenotype. It is there. It is in our study. We have decided that. How is it that we validate that? Normally, we focus on very specific algorithm. We try because we prefer specificity over sensitivity normally. We forget whether it is differential or not. We assume. But how do we validate? Sometimes we do look for false positives, often. How do we do that? So Vera will tell us the ISP view on that, and Amir will explain the details of the VAC4U pipeline, which is really where we want, as VAC4U, try to make this systematic. And many of you may know, I am the vice president of VAC4U. VAC4U is sponsoring this event for this reason. This is something we want to improve and adopt. And then we will try to speak about advances. So this is the status. How are recent advances? Where are tools that we would like to be disseminated across our community in such a way that they are used more often to improve and to use results from validation and address bias from misclassification. So the first person who will illustrate advances is Nicolas Turin. And Nicolas will tell us about some studies he did where he tried to figure out, of course, when you then go and validate, you find that things are complicated, and how we used some recent advances to try and navigate that. So he will tell his story. But still, this is still about our phenotype. And now, in the next step of the workshop, we will try to go a bit like salmons, you know? We'll try to go a bit upper. So we have our specific algorithm, but we have more records than that. And some of those records may have been generated by our disease, right? And then coded somehow differently for many reasons. Now, can we leverage screening algorithms, meaning algorithms that are a bit wider, and try to say, okay, but we want to be specific, but how much are we losing? Can we quantify that just in case we want to have some risk differences, some absolute risks? Can we do that? And Giorgio, who celebrated yesterday his newly acquired PhD, will illustrate this methodology. The methodology that he published in his thesis. And then Giulia and Marco will illustrate the CEVALID project together with Armir and others in this room we are conducted as a pilot to understand how to use Giorgio's methodology in a more systematic manner. And Giulia will explain in general the project. How is it that we try to create screening algorithms? Which examples we are doing in this pilot? And Marco will, because we are still 21st century, will illustrate how we are planning to inject artificial intelligence in our pipeline and how optimistic we are that this will help us to do validation more often while still being very solid and consistent in terms of methodology. And then Giuseppe will go a little bit up in the stream, even more, and try to understand how different actions actually contribute to our measurement, and why will he do that? Because as I said earlier, in some data sources, some actions do not prompt records. So that part of the pathway starts empty. So it's just not there, and we just don't know because you don't have the records. So there is nothing Giorgio can do there because you cannot screen something that doesn't exist. So how is it that we do that? We leverage multi-database studies, because if you do not have your prompt, someone else may have it, and then we do an ablation exercise. So when we analyze in our multi-database study, we try to understand all this pipeline, we separate our data per prompt, and then we play, right? We hide it, hide and seek. We do the ablation. We cancel what is the contribution of each piece of the action. And this is nice also because it helps you understand, it's like the socio-economic of the generation of this measurement, and the clinical as well, because that's part of the game. And then Anna Schulze, and then Elisa will speak about how do we use such validation, because we have our 3 problems that we mentioned and many others that they will tell us. So Anna will speak about quantitative bias analysis. So how is it that we inject, and which validation indices we use to put in our pipeline? Maybe they're not exactly the ones that we have more often available. And Elisa will tell us what happens when, okay, you do your study, you have your validation, and you cannot match the methodology of your study, the analysis that you had foreseen, with the indices that you are available, and you wonder, is there any methodology that would help me? And while we do that, so during our workshop, we will do some role playing, because we are scientists, but also we like to have fun with science. And our Shabi, Ercilia, and Robert accepted to play with us. So every speaker will speak with Shabi. Shabi will play the role, of an investigator who's writing his protocol, and he's really concerned now about misclassification bias in his outcome, but he's not really an expert about how to address that. So he will take recommendations from all the speakers, and at the end, he will tell us what is his plan, how he plans to use those recommendations. And Ercilia and Robert will play the role of researchers that are discussing with their postdocs or their PhD students on the next challenges they want to address, and they will take requests from the public. So what is necessary? What is needed? What are the gaps? What are the methodologies that need to be developed in order for us as a scientific community to be able to address this important family of biases together better, and to make better use of real-world data to produce good quality real-world evidence, in the assumption that somebody will still be interested. So this is the last so we will have an hour to discuss at the end. So let's kick this off. Let's make some rules, guys. We are here to think. We are here to exchange, not to look at the clock and trying to be in time. So at the end of each presentation, of course, we will do the question to understand each other. But if you also have some important question, and maybe you want to start discussing earlier, I don't care. I will not look at the clock. Let's stay here. Let's discuss. Let's understand each other. No, we will go home at some point. We have dinner. That what I'm trying to say is that it's less important to be in time and more important to understand each other. And the same from the friends who are online. Please make questions in the chat, but if you wish, we can give you the microphone, and you can speak, and we can try to understand each other and come at the end of this workshop today with clearer ideas with respect to when we started 15 minutes ago. So let's kick off.